Okay, so just the formal part to remind you that this is not a private conversation, but will ultimately be made available to the public. If there's anything that you don't want to answer or talk about, or you need to take a break, just let me know those things. My role is largely to listen and sort of direct and follow up. So this is your show. Today is Thursday, July 14th, 2016. My name is Andy Reisinger, and I'm conducting a follow-up interview with Roger Friedman here in the Department of Special Collections and Archives at Georgia State University as part of the Great Speckled Bird Oral History Project. And once again, if I can get your verbal consent to be recorded.
I consent to be recorded.
So last time we were talking, we ended somewhere around the 1972 bombing of the Byrd offices and also the May 1972 legal challenges, crises that the Byrd was facing, that the sellers were facing, that the post office was imposing on the Byrd. So we can pick up from there with your recollections?
Yeah, I think it might, what I was thinking is that it might be a good time to just sort of focus on the politics and content of the Byrd explicitly for a little bit.
Yeah, fantastic.
I mean, because I don't want to leave a misimpression, I talked about the difference between the political revolutionaries and the cultural revolutionaries, but it's actually a little more subtle than that, or a little more complicated, I guess. Because remember, this was already 1970 by the time I came down and became active on the Byrd. And so SDS had already gone through its development and evolution and fractionalization, the move of the Weathermen toward violence. So the left-wing politics of the time had already been through a fair amount of development and discussion, and so let's be clear a little bit about what we're talking about here. I think that we pretty much all saw ourselves as revolutionaries. That we saw a world in revolution, with leaders like the Chinese, their revolution, the Cubans, and their revolution, the anti-colonial struggle in Africa. I mean, it wasn't until till like the 75 was Angola's independence, and 77 was Mozambique's independence. So those are all later than this period. So it was a period of fairly intense struggle that was going on at that time in Africa. So the politics of the political revolution side, vis-a-vis the United States, saw oppression of black people as and Hispanic people as being a major evil of the American system, and that the struggles of the American people would be led by blacks and Chicanos. The Black Panther Party being viewed as a vanguard, revolutionary vanguard type party of blacks, and various groups like Young Lords for the Hispanic community. There was an anti-capitalist spirit that animated the revolutionary movement there. I think and in this case, like the cultural revolutionaries, the Abbie Hoffmans, whose motto was whose property is theft, okay, whereas the more socialist-oriented thought of capital as public property rather than private property, but as a means of production. There was all. I'm getting too many things mixed up here. Let's see if I can keep it straight on this. So I can't say that there was ever a vision of what a non-capitalist United States would look like, and that was maybe one of the reasons why it was difficult to achieve, because we didn't really have a vision of what it would take and how it could be done. But we definitely could. We definitely saw the capitalist system as being part of the problem, part of the alienation that people felt. Like even white people who were of privileged status, were still alienated and atomized by capitalism, by the need to compete and the need to earn money, gain power, and that socialism was more humanist, was seen as a more humanist endeavor, a more collective endeavor, where people were in solidarity with each other, and where the workplace was not so much of an alienating workplace without a boss, because we recognized that we were a workplace ourselves, right? Mm. And it might be a sort of a special place when you draw back and look at it, like an atelier of an artist or something like that, where, it's not part of the mainstream economy, right? But it's part of the economy nonetheless. So the cultural side was very interesting, also because I would say that there were lots of legs to the culture. There was film, okay, film. I mean, going back to, I think, I'm Curious Yellow or something like that. There was definitely an avant-garde in film, and the director as artiste. That sort of thinking sort of developed during that time, so everything sort of had to have an expression, a meaning to it, not just art for art's sake or art for entertainment's sake, but art in the service of cultural revolution. Okay, and of course in music, okay, Bob Dylan had really set a high standard for having content in your music. And so everybody was trying to say meaningful things. The bop bop a loo bop a bop a sham bow was like over, right? And the cultural part of the Bird, invoke records, music and film and theater, okay, art, okay. You have to put cartoons in there. They were very, very big. Ron Osborne, who I mentioned before, Steve Abbott. There was Larry Funk was there for a while. We had 3 or 4 cartoonists. I don't know whether cartoonists exist today, because it's sort of an old technology. Also,
I think they call it graphic novel now.
Right.
It's long form.
Right. Right, since Mouse. So there was that, but there's this sort of like both sides were coated with Southern exceptionalism. For example, the politics of the people on the Bird weren't shaped as much by SDS as they were by SOC, Southern Student Organizing Committee, and by SNCC, and by the Highlander Center, okay, So I think to a certain extent, we were saved some of the internecine warfare that took place in other left organizations of the period, partly because of the Southern identity, okay, in that the paper itself did not belong to any particular party or wing. It also was always broad enough so it, like, as opposed to the paper in Providence where everything sort of closed in on itself, as the same people got more involved with each other and with the paper and sort of got ingrown. I don't think the Bird really got ingrown, and part of that maybe has to do with rotation and people moving in and out. But Gene Guerrero wrote a lot of country music articles, right? And his claims for them being revolutionary seem tenuous at best, but they were definitely Southern, and I think that I don't know. It's I think like there were like gay culture in Atlanta also had sort of a Southern exceptionalism in it, that what was the name of that place? The Tea House. It was on Ponce de Leon, right at Myrtle Street. It was like a meat and two vegetables place, Mary Mac's.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but it had sort of a foo-foo attitude to it, that one with it, or the Magnolia Room or something like that, and I don't think that, it was, there was a lot, maybe it's my imagination, but it seemed like, the North, there was a lot more sort of hardcore, extreme physical stuff going on, as opposed to here, at this distance. And even at that time, I was not that close, but just another example of Southern exceptionalism. All the movement stuff, it was always in all of the mobilization meetings or whatever sort of a meeting you went to. It was like, we had to do things our way because we were the South, right? The same techniques, didn't necessarily work as worked up north, because the peoples were coming from a different place, coming from a different experience,
And what do you mean by the physicalness?
Like leather jackets and rough sex, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
It just seemed like people were not so much like that here. It seemed sort of softer, but again, takes all kinds, and you never really know what goes on behind closed doors.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you happen to have a policeman come over and you end up in the Supreme Court. And also on the culture side, because it's not like there's so much in opposition, is that because there were elements of each sort of in each, like the women's movement and the gay liberation movement, for example, have to be considered cultural, I think, because that was where they acted. They acted on the family, and they acted on sex roles and views of men's and women's roles in society, which hadn't been like any sort of a target of like classical socialism, which was like worker based, right? And to a large extent featured very traditional sex roles of male worker, woman, housewife. So you had those elements. You had ecology. So like 1970 in March, I think, am I right? April 22, 1970 was the first Earth Day. Okay, and we regularly had articles with a ecological focus, and there was a caucus of bicyclers right? I mean, like the Southern Bicycle League was always being written up. Bill, what's his name, and Stephanie and Tom became bicycle converts, you know, and Jenkins was a bicyclist, big bicyclist. So there were sort of the alternate culture movements like Sevananda Food Co-op that's still around, but several health food stores. You know, there were various sorts of collective living situations. There were community gardens that started up during that period. So it was, you know, there was the bird itself sort of lived off the community and served the community, you know, at the same time. You know, it's very interesting, you know, to think about, you know, there were all these anti-war demonstrations going on during all this period, you know, led by the National Mobilization, you know, or organized, let's say. I mean, because there were all these organizations that were participating in. There were local ones building toward national ones, certainly like 2 national ones at least a year, you know, and it was always in the streets, and it's you know, and then there wasn't that movement anymore, and it's sort of, maybe it was like the all-volunteer army that took a lot of the heat off. I don't know, maybe it was frustration with the politics, you know. I mean, took a lot of energy, you know, to work on the politics, you know. I've been trying to think about, you know, like, when did I actually start reading political literature, and what political literature was it? And I know I participated in some study groups, you know, but no one I've asked about remembers the bird itself having any study groups. So I'm not sure where they happened, you know. But, you know, we did, you know, like some classic Lenin and Mao Zedong on contradiction, and a couple of on revolution. We read Monopoly Capital was a monthly review book by Braverman and Paul Sweezy. Who has his own Supreme Court case, Sweezy versus New Hampshire, First Amendment rights, as a teacher in the late 40s. I know I was subscribing to Monthly Review during this whole time. It was big with Regis Debray and some stuff like that. I know when I visited Chile and Pablo Neruda's house, they had his room set up the way it was at the time of his death, and he had his monthly reviews on the shelf, and they were the same monthly reviews that I had. I mean, so there was a sense of an international socialist movement, you know. William Hinton Fan Shen was very important, talking about the rural collectivization in China after World War II, after the success of the Chinese Revolution. We read W.B. Du Bois, Black Reconstruction in America. Um, I mean, there was a lot of politics going on, and you had to really be immersed in it to understand it and participate in it if you wanted to. It was, and that was a place where I had to catch up a fair amount. So I think that the reason that the Bird didn't fall into sectarianism was partly because the sectarianism had a lot to do with this vanguard party belief that revolution had to be led by a vanguard party. Okay. And everybody wants to be the vanguard. So, I mean, I'm sure that there are principal differences, between the various groups that formed at that time. And maybe even some unprincipled differences. But people thought that the problem was that they were not sufficiently unified in their political thought, is why they weren't as able to carry out what they wanted to carry out. And of course, the Bird was never made it an issue to be more together about, to be unified in its politics. I mean, it couldn't serve. I mean, some of it was just being a newspaper, right? I talked about that a little last time. Is that part of it is that we were desperate for news, for real news that we weren't able to get from the Journal-Constitution. Part of it, we were, there was this feedback, the calendar, the event, the article about the event, so there was a service thing going on. And, I think I indicated a little bit about what the weekly schedule was like, but it was pretty busy, You had a lot of things to do. A lot of things had to come together every week. So we didn't waste a lot of time with internecine warfare. We were a lot more problem solving and, keeping the wolf from the door. Except for Wolf von Stinkenauer, he was always allowed in the door. Though he always had to pay for his ads. Okay, it was interesting that his pieces. I think once we had a discussion about whether we should let him submit his pieces editorially as opposed to being an advertisement. But I think we resolved that on the basis that he was a little strong to take in, and if it were free for him to submit stuff, it would become a big burden on us. But at any rate, I digress. So I've talked a little bit about the content, I guess, of the bird. Oh yeah, I know. I had started talking about ecology. I had talked about police, courts, and prisons as being my particular beat. And so police was a big part of the sort of street culture that was going on. I mean, there was always conflict with police about drugs and about loitering and about sleeping out in the open, and all kinds of stuff like that. And the hippies were targeted by the city administration, you know. I mean, everybody called that piece of Peachtree Street there the Strip, except for the Journal-Constitution. Okay, they called it Tight Squeeze, which was a name that came from, like, after Atlanta was burned, you know, and people were sort of camping out there. Okay, so, but they never wanted to, you know, give it the name that people themselves were using for it. Just didn't want to accept the society, the culture there, you know, and there, you know, things would be okay for a while, and then there'd be busts, or, you know, there'd be a new set of park regulations, or, you know, all the, you know, every few months there was something going along locally. And if it wasn't in here, it was with the bird sellers in another town, or, you know, and that's not to mention the Black Panthers and the sort of repression they faced, and the COINTELPRO from the FBI designed to bust them up, okay, and the constant trials that resulted from that. There was a New Haven Panther trial that was going on at the same time as a trial in California with George Jackson. You know, there was the complete shoot up of the Chicago office. I mean, there was always, you know, police activity, and, you know, all the demonstrations incurred police activity of various strengths, you know. Then there were prisons, you know, because we did have George Jackson, and we had a bigger sense of what was going on in prison. You know, we had the Attica riots, which followed the Auburn riots, about conditions, you know, prison conditions, and, you know, we had our own prison conditions down here in Reedsville, which I'll probably get to in another context, you know, but we were having trouble getting the bird into prisons, okay. It was free to prisoners. We received a lot of prison mail from prisoners talking about their situation. You know, people saying that they were railroaded into prison, and which definitely happened, and terrible conditions, and I mean, they weren't being rented out anymore, but that hadn't been so long ago, you know, and you know, like just the attitude of the prison administration, you know, it's like they commonly refer to saying, "Oh, we got 450 head of prisoners here." You know, I mean, they used cattle terms when they were talking about them and moving them and things like that, you know, and that's how they viewed them, you know. And then, of course, it was all had this racial content in it also, because of black prisoners being sent to white rural prisons, you know, where where desegregation had not yet occurred, You know, I mean, I'm not just in the prisons, but in the society itself. The schools were still not integrated, things like that. You know, so the attitudes, the expectations of a black urban prisoner are like completely out of the contemplation of a white rural jailer, you know, and bound to be conflict arising from that, you know. And it was, not to mention the, you know, power relationship and the, I don't know quite the right word for it, the diminution of a person's self-worth being on the wrong end of a power relationship. You know, so there was a lot of activity in those areas. There was labor. I mean, there were lots of strikes that we supported over time, and they were always well covered. There were the battle over redevelopment, you know, the historically black neighborhoods down near the stadium and near the Civic Center, you know, were being wiped out for stadia and expressways. And our own experience with being urban renewal out of the Colony Square area, you know. So,
Go a little deeper with that. Being urban renewal out of Colony Square.
Oh, well, the first birdhouse was actually bought out as part of Colony Square. Was it bought out? No, it wasn't bought out. What it was is that was when they extended Juniper Street from 10th Street to 14th Street or 11th Street. It didn't used to go all the way to 14th Street. Okay, and that's where the birdhouse, I think, was up at, you know, it was across from Colony Square now it's part of Juniper Street. But no, so Colony Square was built as like a large mixed residential commercial office complex, which it still is, you know, and it was also sort of tied in with growth of the High Museum and the AT&T, the Colonnade building, I think is what it was, that was on the 16th Street and Peachtree on the northwest side, back in front of where the High Museum is now, where the AT&T building is. It may have a different name by now, who knows? At any rate, but that was where the Grotto, is that the right name? There were a couple of gay clubs that were over there, you know. Oh yeah, there was another neighborhood that was being gentrified, in that that Georgia Tech was pushing north towards State Street and 14th. So it was also growing into pretty sure that area was more white working class at that time, but that was also, you know, being pushed out. It was and what was Buckhead then? Well, Lenox Square, I guess.
Mm.
You know, they're the Disco Kroger. Um, um, I mean, it's an example of like the things being done for the benefit of the real estate moguls, okay, of which Sam Massell as mayor was one, right? And it sort of was the beginning of the remaking of Midtown toward what it is today, which is, you know, lots of high-rise offices and a certain amount of commercial sort of support space, expensive housing between Piedmont and Peachtree Street.
Mm.
You know, I mean, there's been a lot of changes in the footprint and land use of Atlanta in these 40 years or however long it's been. I can't go through all of them, but it seems like that was sort of the root of them at that time, when people started jumping out of the old central downtown and opening up new business and shopping districts progressively farther out. I guess I need to get the data. The Perimeter Mall was probably one of the early, you know, ex-urban malls.
Mm.
Imagine it being ex-urban at that point, but you know, it's not about the bird, but it's part of the change of Atlanta. So I guess that's a lot of the mise-en scene of the bird, what things were like there.
Let me go back and
Okay.
follow up on a couple things
Okay.
that you mentioned. I guess possibly one of the more direct questions is, do you recall specific people that were involved in the reading groups with you?
I mean, I've tried. But the people who I would have thought would have been the most obvious have said no, that didn't happen. So maybe it was a little bit later. Maybe it started toward 72 or something like that. I haven't been able to actually place that. You know, I'm sorry.
No, I just was curious. Other folks have mentioned reading groups as well. Like particularly Tom Coffin mentioned, you know, working with reading groups when as he was working in the sort of engineering field and
Right.
working with, you know, his fellow workers around those issues. So that would have been a different population. But so it's clear that people were having these reading groups, and
Right.
yeah,
Right.
and to see where there was overlap and not. I also wanted to follow up sort of more broadly. Firstly, on the notion of Southern exceptionalism,
Mm-hmm.
that you characterize as an orientation of the bird and movements here. So if you might just elaborate a little more on that, and particularly in the context of the bird, relating that to the fact that this Southern exceptionalism is operating at the Bird through so many non-Southerners.
um, well, I guess you have to start with the race issue, okay, which was the original Southern exceptionalism, that it permeated the society, that it had a special set of challenges, in terms of legal structures, all of the fights about desegregation, okay, about public accommodations, about voting, about governing. I mean, about employment, okay, about which jobs black people were allowed to have, okay, that if the North had been a melting pot for various ethnicities of basically European immigrants, okay, the South had been a unmelting pot, right? I mean, increasingly harder, formal, understood racial discriminations in society, and the opposition that formed in respect to that, the NAACP, the SCLC, SNCC, okay, the Mississippi Summer, those were black struggles led by blacks. They weren't proletarian struggles, okay, and it was not about class, it was about caste, and it had survived. I mean, I'm going to look up his name. So there's been what's his name? He's a playwright. He's at Emory. He's from North Carolina.
I know who you're talking about.
Yeah.
White man who...
Right. Who related to the blacks because his family was so poor they couldn't go to the segregation academy.
Yeah, and he ended up maybe had sort of an awakening experience.
Yes.
Maybe at Koinonia or...
No, what it was is it's a great book. It's like, when the first blacks came into his school, okay, he just knew that he could make some points by, just going up to this girl and saying, "You're a black nigger," something like that, and she came back with, like, "I'm black and I'm proud," and blah, 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 and like, just jolted him into realizing,
Jim
yes.
Grimsley?
Jim Grimsley, very good. Very good. It's quite a good book, So, like, it's not just you have to be taught to be hate. You have to be taught to hate. It's like it was so ingrained that people weren't even realizing that they were doing it. Okay, and so it's like at least every white person in the South, had to go through, or ought to have gone through, this experience of facing up to how they had been brought up and how it had impacted their lives and what their expectations were. And it made this idea of white skin privilege very clear. Okay, I mean, we hear it a lot today, and I'm not saying that it's any less existent today than it was then, but I mean, you were being confronted and you had to choose a side. Okay, it was it was a very different place here in the South. Okay, and its struggles were in a different place. I mean, I'm here in the Labor History Archive, right? So I'm not going to say that there wasn't any labor history here in the South, but even that labor history was different, than I think in the North. The textile mill towns of the South, I don't know. I think we're different. We're different than the steel mill towns of the North, and certainly the what is it? The past isn't gone. It's not even the past. It's like the class nature of society remained here, I think, longer. I think people were, putting on their white gloves and going down to the Magnolia Room for tea, longer than that practice continued elsewhere. The social mores of the upper classes, So I think that's the root of the exceptionalism. Well, maybe not the exceptionalism. It's ways in which the South was different, but how that became exceptional was that the same sorts of tactics that worked in the North did not work in the South, because people were not coming from the same place. Okay, they had to make this journey through their own personal connection to racism, before they could emerge, into the glorious future of the workers' society. And it also made working together different, okay, because maybe not so much, because there had always been the Garveyites, which was, I think, more of a northern phenomenon in the black community, in a sense of separatism, black separatism. But I think it certainly came to fruition with the SNCC experience. I think that made it very clear, that there was going to be some, hopefully comradely, but at least for now separate development, and that it was, necessary, to dare I say, unwhiten the aspirations of the black community, to allow the black culture to be celebrated rather than put down. And of course, there was a lot of economic equality to be achieved, I mean, when I don't have Maynard Jackson's dates on here when he became mayor, I guess that'd been about 80?
No, before that.
76, but not as early as 72. That was definitely Massell still. But, there was, when he became mayor, there was, and I think it sort of affected his reputation, but it was vital, is that there were lots of white firms that were supplying the city with services out of tradition and history, okay? And that was one of the first things he did, is that he brought in black contractors to handle things like that, the janitorial services. I think actually that's where Hosea Williams actually, his company got some of their businesses from the city, but certainly things like stationery, office supplies, printing, all of those services were available, insurance, bonding, all those services were available in the black community and banking. And so Maynard Jackson moved those, from the white incumbents to a new group of black suppliers, vendors, and that caused a lot of screaming from the white community. But on the other hand, it made for the black community to have jobs and income and that it had not participated with before. I mean, I think as I recall, by the 70s, the police force was beginning to be integrated, but there were only two junior cops who were black as late as the mid 50s, I believe.
Yeah, I think it was around the late 40s or early 50s when they officially integrated, but yeah, very token
Right. So fire, we had to go through fire stuff same way other places did, but at any rate, we were trying to throw off this burden, okay? And the burden affected all of us personally and socially and politically, okay? And so that was the source of the exceptionalism. Now, I'm not putting, when you get into the exceptionalism and the national movements at that time, I'm not saying that people didn't do it partly out of, maintaining some sort of autonomy inside a much larger movement. It was a pretty good excuse. People would accept it. Otherwise, the unique Southern organizations would have been sucked up and homogenized, which I don't think would have been good. I don't know. I mean, I suppose if you're a true socialist, the International Party will be the human race, right? Um, and there certainly was the Socialist Workers' Party here, and they're the same everywhere. But I think I think I'll put that off until later. But I do think in all these movements there was some recognition that things just couldn't be done the same way at the same speed, or at the same level of theoretical correctness in the South. We're just so benighted.
Yeah, so with that, it seems like, and please correct me if you understand it differently, but it seems that a big influence or current behind that would be the several founding members of the Bird who were involved with SOC, and the need to organize white folks around issues of race in the South after the split with SNCC. But also you used the language of doing organizing work in the South had its own burdens, or unique burdens, exceptional burdens. So that's one sort of side of the exceptionalism, is things are different and maybe more complicated, more difficult in the movement here. But also at the same time, with reference to your point that this also allowed some autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to put any words out there, but it almost seems like that the Southern exceptionalism was a feather in the cap of organizers in the South, of like, we have this special burden, but also maybe we're in the vanguard, or pushing in a different way, but necessary, that other folks don't see or don't have to deal with directly.
I think the latter is really what I'm saying. I mean, it's again, I'll probably get into this later, but there's this Southern politeness, okay, where you don't show your feelings, right? But you damn well have them, okay? It's and it's like, like Grimsley said, there was a social structure and everyone knew it, right? And no one had to be formally taught it. You just sort of breathed it in with the air. It's I mean, when you look back, I don't know that the North was much more successful in terms of organizing revolutionary movement than the South was, but definitely I would say that the idea of well, I'm overgeneralizing, I guess. I just wanted to make the point, I think, that we saw the South as having its own peculiar issues, its own right, peculiar institutions, and that they needed a different approach, and that there were people at different states. It's like for people in feudalism, capitalism is better, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you just have to, take the situation where it is. You can't confuse yourself that the situation isn't also, they may be capitalist now, but they still need to get to socialism in the future, right? Or need to start practicing it, have it as a goal or something. Let's not just make the goal to be, a million Citizens Trust banks or something like that, So there was the exceptionalism. I did see it in the organizations. Okay, whether it was a tactic to try and preserve turf, or a real expression of what people were going through, it sort of depends on your view of what motivates people, right? You can talk a good socialist game and still be on a power trip of your own. So.
So to follow up on
Yeah.
on a different point, when you were talking about the women's movement and the gay liberation movement and sort of where that fit in with the bird, you described it as more cultural, and in explaining that, explained it through sort of a socialist analytic of gender dynamics in the workplace, the household. How do you think that played out at the Bird in discussions about the coverage of the gender and sexual dynamics of the paper, of the staff, the way the reporting was done vis-a-vis this cultural, political divide that's not a hard and fast divide, but a lot of people that talk about the Bird mention that there is this rift. And then lastly, this in the context of the very famous feminist slogan, the personal is political.
Mm-hmm.
So I just find it interesting that you described it as fitting on the cultural side of things.
Right.
Which also often seem to be described more as.
I'm not saying there's
terms.
no politics of sex roles and stuff. Definitely, that's politics, and the personal is the political was definitely a slogan. but can be carried too far because of the political as well. I mean, it has to do with the forms of power. Wielding power is, I guess, the term that I'm using it. How power is distributed, how power is accumulated and exercised. Okay, and in whose interest it operates. So that's sort of and traditional socialism, and going back to the labor struggles is where a lot of these roots come from. And you see it without even acknowledging it. The thought of it is like, I've never seen a meeting on the left, including the Bird, that was handled by Robert's Rules of Order. Okay, it's always a lot more. You come in with a few agenda items, which may be fixed, but usually it will be an opportunity to add agenda items. You'll go through announcements, either at the beginning or at the end, depending on the group, right? And you'll work your way through the agenda items, and the agenda items should be tied to action. So it's a lot more like what you'd find in a business meeting, I don't know whether business meetings are sort of frowned on these days, but there was a period back in the 80s, when there was, things like, no meeting without an agenda, okay, stuff like that. Put time limits on, identify roles and responsibilities. All those rules for having good meetings started coming out in that order. But that's the sort of style of meeting that we had inherited from, the labor movement. Okay. So the I would say that the politics of women's liberation is definitely politics, and that my classifying it on the culture side, is like, that culture is political. Okay, I mean, that's film is political, right? I mean, music is political. That's, all of that lifestyle stuff was political, especially when there's cultural change going on. It creates a conflict situation which will resolve itself in part depending on power relationships. Okay, so it's, that's when it really becomes political, is when there's change. Okay, otherwise you hardly even notice it. It's like the ether, right? I mean, who knew there was going to be such a fuss about circumcision, right? Now it's a big deal. I mean, so with respect to the women's liberation issue in the paper, I would say that it was mostly resolved by having the rotation and making sure that there were women in writing roles, in editing roles. It wasn't always enough. I mean, as I said, the original the birdhouse takeover, it was before I arrived, which was like the hardcore, shut up, sit down, and listen because you've got to deal with this moment, right? And from time to time, it would definitely arise because it was an issue in all sorts of other movements as well. Equal pay for equal work, sex roles in employment, what jobs a woman could get. So it kept a Holy Family Hospital. It's a long-standing strike that finally got settled. I know at least 4 people on the Bird covered it because it went on so long. So the issue kept arising, and then there were the other things that could be done, the things like the child care cooperative I talked about, okay? The things about men cooking, okay? Or eating co-ops, things like that broke apart some of those sex roles and freed women to pursue other roles that were of personal interest to them, right? The whole women's health thing, I meant to look up the date of Our Bodies, Ourselves, but that was a huge, huge change, led to women being more understanding of, responsible for, and in charge of their own bodies, right? It was it's sort of like you still hear about, there are places where the doctor's not allowed to touch the female patient, okay, or not allowed to have her disrobe, okay, so that things, so that there's no scientific basis for treatment, and it was sort of that. Women had the vapors, they were, there's just all kinds of superstition and stuff associated with women and childbirth and menstruation and all this stuff, that, had to be cleaned out of the closet, and get a fresh start, with a real rational view that, maybe part of it came from the Vietnam War, where you had men and women soldiers serving together, taking up all the military roles, maybe not at the top, but, there were important cadres who were women. Madame Bin was held up as the example there. So it was like another set of societal expectations that were changing, and societal roles, and sometimes it was conflictive, and sometimes there were divorces, and there were people. There were lots of houses that were all women, or women and their kids. It was a different it was a time when the view of women in their roles and themselves was changing and changing rapidly. I mean, as I say, I wasn't around for the worst moments of it at the Bird, but like a person who tried to dominate the discussion, who talked too much at a meeting, okay, that was considered a masculine, bossy sort of behavior, okay, and was definitely frowned upon, okay. So I don't know. I wandered away from your topic. I guess I just think it may have affected other people, who started the people who started the Bird, as such comrades, right? Found out that things weren't so comradely for the women comrades. Right, and had to go through that personally. I guess I didn't have to, and I think also that was one of the, I was saying last time, it was one of the areas where I was particularly blind, being sort of weak on the social emotional quotient, not really understanding a lot of the people, especially some of the women that I was seeing at that time. Okay.
So you mentioned the different living arrangements and all women housing, women and children. What were your living arrangements during this period?
I went through a series of apartments, mostly shared. I shared with Steve Wise on 8th Street for quite a while. I shared with a movement lawyer named Ralph Goldberg on 5th Street for a while. We had a mixed shared house over near the Salvation Army by Ponce de Leon and North Highland for a while. I lived by myself in an apartment in Briarcliff Terrace off North Island, between North Island and Briarcliff. I lived briefly with Tom and Stephanie, but we were just too different. It didn't last for like 8 weeks or something like that. It just was clearly not working. Oh yeah, and I lived in an apartment on Myrtle Street and North Avenue. Lived there for a number of years. So, and then we'll get to the. I lived upstairs from Neil Herring in the upstairs apartment in his house for a number of years. I know you've interviewed Neil, but we'll get to that. Neil's in the future in this discussion.
So were you on paid staff while you were?
I was on paid staff some of the time, and I was not on paid staff some of the time. I was trying to locate some of that, trying to put some of that in sequence, because I began getting involved with legal work. I know that in 19 71 that I was a secretary at the Southern Regional Office of the ACLU. And I know that I was a secretary for Al Horn for a while, and a secretary over at Adair Goldthwaite, a labor law firm, for a while. And I know that I lived on a mixture of those half jobs in bird selling for a while. But
Bird selling.
yeah, street sales.
Okay, yeah. Did you have a certain beat or turf that you regularly covered?
I'm trying to remember where. It may have been right downtown here. I know I sold some down here. Oh, what I forgot to talk about before, I'm sorry,
Yeah, no.
I meant to talk about it, was one of the things was the classified ad policy. Okay, that became an issue. You know, a lot of people bought the bird because they thought it would have filthy pictures in it. Okay, and it didn't really have filthy pictures in it. You know, these are the people who were driving down Ponce de Leon, right? That was another Wolf's sales spot. He was there for many years. But we also had a classified ad section, which, you know, was a Craigslist predecessor, right? And I know that at one point after I was there, we had a discussion about whether we should continue accepting sexually oriented classified ads, okay? And decided not to, okay? That they were too sexually exploitative for us to continue to present them, you know, and we took those out. So there's a case where it certainly emerged as operationally in the bird. Okay, sorry.
No. And what do you recall of what you were doing in your free time and for enjoyment during those years?
I mean, I enjoyed the whole thing. I mean, it was, you know, it was very active. It was very exciting.
Well, more
You know.
leisure.
Right. Well, I was Mr. Fireball. I wasn't into leisure that much. I've made up for it. But I would say that, like, movies, concerts, hanging out in the park, smoking pot.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was like it's always been this thing for me, is to, you know, whether I should try and have an integrated life, okay, or whether I should have divided life, right? Work home dichotomy, right? And I would say that the bird time was like really there in the terms of integrated, right? You know, like what would you call doing childcare, right? It wasn't work, it wasn't home, but it was both work and politics and home, in a sense, right? You know, so it was. I was going for integration. Later on, I've tried for distinct separation, and it just sort of. It's more situational. I think you don't even get to make that choice most of the time.
Mm-hmm. So I guess the last thing around the bird that I'll specifically ask, and you can talk about whatever else you like. But is there any theme or issue that's especially memorable to you? In the coverage, in the response to it, however.
Well, I guess I talked a little bit about how I enjoyed covering demonstrations, okay, because that was like there's always this participant reporter dichotomy, okay, and we talked about trespass privilege, right? You know, when the police came, you could show your trespass and, you know, cut out, right,
Mm-hmm.
if you wanted to, and so I guess I like those experiences, partly because it did give an opportunity to voice opposition to all of the Nixonian stuff that was going on in those years, including the war and the Supreme Court and, you know, all kinds of Nixonian things. And because it sort of like eliminated the participant reporter dichotomy. Those were things that I always really enjoyed doing. You know, I think I told you last time, just the mailing, just having a whole sack of the bird, you know, going to Western North Carolina, you know, was like impressive to me,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that we had that much reach, you know. I mean, I think we were, that there were a lot of us who were like close, okay, got close to a lot of people on the bird there. And that was important too, to have, you know, a feeling of belonging and acceptance and mutual activity and, you know, stuff like that.
Who were you especially close to?
I guess Steve and I got to be pretty close. I was pretty close with Tom and Stephanie, but they were, you know, you couldn't really hang out at their house, okay? I was more of they were always very busy and productive and stuff like that, and that's one reason why we didn't really hit it off when I tried to live there, is like our personal pace levels were different, you know. I mean, I felt close to Gene Guerrero. I mean, we were very, very different, but it was like pretty open about our differences. I was able to talk to him and have good discussions and stuff. Who else? Well, I got to know Nan during that time, that's for sure. I mean, it's sort of starting to mix in now because, let's take Reber Bolt, for example. Reber Bolt was a lawyer at the Southern Regional Office of the ACLU, okay? I was his secretary for a while during this time. He lived in the house over by North Highland and Ponce de Leon, okay? If you take a look at the press conference after the fire, it's me and Reber and Jeff Jacobson, who was another ACLU lawyer, okay? So, I'd say Reber and Neil I got to know through the Bird, okay, even though they weren't necessarily, it wasn't their primary thing. I'm going to get this messed up, aren't I? So there was the Institute for Southern Studies, sort of coexisted at about the same time, okay? Definitely during some of the same time, but I don't think it started quite so early. It was a think tank, and it published a magazine, Southern Exposure. Bob Hall, Jackie Hall, and Sue Thrasher were the main names associated with that. Sue Thrasher had long been a friend of Tom and Stephanie. She had, Sue that is, had also been part of the National Student Association at the time when they were receiving CIA money. Mm-hmm. I'm pretty sure she was one of the winning ones. And
one of the what?
Whitting.
Mm-hmm.
And Bob Hall was very big into labor history. I don't know, you're the one who knows that area. He probably stands out, whether he stands out at all.
And Jackie.
But certainly Jackie, who was, one of the originators, shall I say, of oral history, or the legitimators, whatever it takes. I mean, Studs Terkel was definitely older than, but as far as maybe being recognized in academia, she was definitely big on that. And so Southern Exposure, they view the Institute as sort of like a DC think tank, but the Southern Exceptional version. And so they did a lot of Southern labor history in it, and they did a lot of investigative journalism, which I guess I'll get to in a minute. But I guess, and my point is that they were funded with foundation money. Okay, so they were always doing the fundraising thing. And I had some familiarity with that in Providence, where we would have to go begging to the churches for money, right? I much preferred the style of the Bird, which was self-supporting, okay? But when the Bird was firebombed, the first place we laid out the next paper was down at their office. Their office was at 88 Walton Street, which was a pretty famous place in history. The Voter Education Project was there. The ACLU was there of Georgia. The Georgia office was there. The Institute for Southern Studies was there, and the Georgia Power Project, which I'll get to very shortly, was there also. And you know, I can't remember whether it was just downstairs or whether it was across the street. There was a porno theater, okay, whose case also ended up before the Supreme Court. Okay, it's somebody rather be Slayton. Slayton was the district attorney of Fulton County at the time. I forget what the issue, which maybe it was deep throat or something like that. It was an obscenity case that arose. So it was a sort of a hotbed of activity. And the Southern Regional Office of the ACLU was around the corner on Fairley Street. So at any rate, it's like So Sue Thrasher had one side of a duplex, and Tom and Stephanie had another half of the duplex. When I first moved to Atlanta, they were in on 9th Street then, and then I think Sue moved to DC for a while or something, for whatever was that think tank that's almost like the Institute for Southern Studies, Institute for Policy Studies. Right. I think she went up to there for a while. And then she came back, and that's when Southern Studies started. I guess that's right. You know, and that's when Tom and Stephanie moved over to Highland View. So at any rate, so we were all pretty close, I think. Oh yeah, because Neil at that time was living just next door to the Sig Samuels Cleaner on Monroe Drive at 8th Street.
Neil Herring?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and then down Seal Place and on to Monroe Circle, we had Jane LaRue, and we had the Bill Fibbin and Ron Osborne, and so you could pretty much go hang out most of these places.
And were you working for the Institute for Southern Studies, or?
No, I wasn't. The reason that I brought it up is that it sort of ties into what I did after.
Okay, so let's go there. When did you sort of leave the Bird, or was it a staggered leaving of the Bird, and why?
Okay, so the fire, immediately we got a lot of response and we got a lot of help. Okay, but we were without an office. Okay, where were our vendors supposed to pick up the papers? They couldn't do that downtown. We couldn't use the institute for that. We had to find a place. Okay, and the only place that we could find in the area was a house on Juniper Street, which was bad because A, there was no place to park, and B, it was up on a hill, so there was this long flight of steps to get up to the front porch to the birdhouse. So it wasn't easy to move papers in and out. It wasn't easy to have meetings there because of the parking. It wasn't easy to, the cellars were sort of off the beaten path for the for the sellers as well. So it wasn't as good a place, and also, so it's like we burned an incredible amount of energy just responding to the fire and keeping on going after it. Okay, I think you can see, if you look at the birds around the fire. Externally, it looks pretty much the same as it did before the fire. Okay, I mean, we didn't skip a beat, but I think it like really took it out of us, maintaining that pace and all the overhead of reestablishing and putting up with the inconveniences and stuff like that. So within a while after the fire, I was ready to go off staff. I just, I was burned out with the bird, and I think a lot of people experienced similar levels of burned outness around that point. And I never really left it. I mean, I continued to come in and like do typing and stuff like that, but I was, I was not on paid staff, I don't think, after 72 at all. So in July of 72, the Institute for Southern Studies did a issue on Georgia Power, okay, and it went into its finances, it went into its employment practices. It was extremely segregated, both on the management side and the labor side, because it was all craft unions, right, that were working there, that hadn't been really desegregated yet. It was going for lots of rate increases because it was trying to support a nuclear program, which was anti-environmental, okay? And at the same time, it didn't want to have to build scrubbers and other equipment to clean up its discharges into the air, okay? So it was trying to get coal with fewer impurities from South Africa, okay? So the issue sort of spurred or accompanied, it's hard to tell which came first, is a chicken and egg thing, right? The Georgia Power Project, okay? And Neil was very big on the Georgia Power Project, and they had intervened in the Public Service Commission hearings on the rate request, okay? But they needed to put on some sort of an affirmative case, and they needed to have a brief, okay? And they couldn't find a lawyer who was willing to undertake that task. But hey, I had been typing briefs for a long time, and I had sort of gotten into legal research when I was working at the ACLU and these other places, okay? So I said, well, I'll go ahead and give it a try, and so we wrote up some testimony, and I typed it up on mimeograph stencils. I talked a little bit about mimeograph last time, but this time it's for like each page is on has to be mimeographed, okay? And so, I mean, you have to be really accurate with your typing because the correction fluid was like wax in something like fingernail polish, okay? And you had to like fill in the places where you had been, and where you had made mistakes, and then dry it, but make sure it didn't stick because otherwise the stencil would tear when you went to use it. So it was like a mess to correct. So you really, and if you were using a manual typewriter, you had to really hit hard to cut cleanly, right? I'm trying to remember whether I had a Selectric at that point to work with or not. I think I was maybe working on an old Royal at that point, old Royal manual. So I said, okay, I'll proceed to try and write this brief and come up with some testimony, and did some research and, plotted Georgia Power against some other companies and stuff. So we put on some testimony, and we were, I became like a staff person on the Georgia Power project.
Being paid.
Yeah.
A little something.
A little something, but being paid, right? I don't think Neil was being paid at that point. Neil was like the main organizer, and, I was like the research and legal team, and we did some pretty incredible things. I don't know, did he talk about it much in his?
He did talk some, yeah.
Okay. Like, I remember this time, I know, it was right around this time I got the very first Hewlett-Packard LaserJet that ever made, okay? I saw that and I said, oh wow, this could be useful for typesetting and stuff, right? So I got it, okay? And so I had a few different font cartridges to go with it, okay? And so I must have had my computer at that time. I got, again, this is one of the early personal computers, okay, not the Altair that is very famous, but like very soon after that, it was an 8-bit Z80 bus computer,
And
personal computer.
What year would this have been around?
72, something like that.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe 73, maybe as late as 73, right? So we made we took like an 8.5 by 11 sheet, okay? And we had a small strip down one side, okay, that had like text about South African coal and the rate increase and stuff like that. And the right side cut into 3 postcards, okay, one of which was addressed to us and was sort of a petition type, sign the petition type card. Second one was to the Public Service Commission, urging them to deny the rate increase and stop South African coal. And the third one was to the president of Georgia Power, telling him to do that. And we printed up lots of those. We distributed lots of those, and people used them. It was like one of the most effective single pieces of media that, I've been involved with leaflets and pamphlets and, this, that, and the other thing, and newsletters, the Bird, all kinds of stuff, and it worked really well. It was a good piece to talk to people with, but also to leave people with. So, you could hand it out and it would work. So we did a lot of those. Georgia Power kept, we were active on all the fronts that I mentioned, because like the IBW went on strike. Okay, so we were there with them. Or there was an EEOC case against the IBEW and Georgia Power, and like we would be there, supporting the black workers. There was a lot, and of course there were Public Service Commission hearings. Okay, wow. I had this dark green polyester suit, okay, and like green and white and brown polyester knit tie, and I had these sort of suede boots with a green cutout on them. Okay, so this was my Public Service Commission formal dress. Okay, so we participated in a lot of Public Service Commission hearings. Okay, and one commissioner in particular, Bobby Pafford, who was from South Georgia. He was he from Dublin, I think, something like that. He was so Southern that the possessive plural second person for him was y'allses. At any rate, so the chairman was a guy named Ben Wiggins, and they were not used to public participation, particularly not public participation by people who were also out to show it up as being a rubber stamp for the power company. Okay, so we would bring in lots of people to testify. We'd give them little nuggets, and they'd say, complain about the rate increase, but they, the Public Service Commission didn't want to hear people complaining about the rate. So these little nuggets, about the coal or about the labor or about land issues, Georgia Power, or cabins by the lake. Georgia Power ended up with a bunch of cabins by the lakes that went with its coal-fired plants. Okay. I'm losing all my geography. There's one like east on I-20. There's a lake, and then Lake
Hartwell?
No, I think Hartwell and Allatoona are over on the Chattahoochee. Okay, but the Alabama has a lake also that I go through whenever I go to Panama City. Not even remembering that one, but at any rate, they built cabins around these lakes, that they dispensed as political favors. Okay, and so we were always able to give people something to talk to the commissioners about, and Georgia Power just hated it, and their lawyers in particular. They were represented by by the Troutman Sanders firm, okay, and the lawyer there was a fellow named Tench Cox, okay, was the one who handled the rate proceedings for them, okay, and so he would keep asking the commissioner, God, why are we dragging on like this? Why can't we get down to business and just, this is not a puppet show or something like that, as long as we could deal out testimony and filed testimony and stuff like that, and so I learned how to do. I mean, I had always known, not always known, but from some point, maybe around 5th grade, I read a book about accounting, okay? And so then I had done the books at the Bird, right? So of course I can go in and analyze the financial statements and operating statements of Georgia Power. We had to fight them a lot to get stuff, but we finally got their monthly operating reports where we could actually come up with new stuff, make graphs and charts and showing what was working and what, why was it so much more expensive over here than it was over here, and stuff like that. And I thought we did a lot of good work, and that was part of it. The thing that was always bothering us was, why was Georgia Power always wanting to sell all these bonds? Okay, its capital structure was getting way out of whack with too much debt, not enough equity. So the bond prices were going up, okay, and the reason, of course, was that all the profits were going to build the nuclear plant, right? Okay, so their profit level was coming down to the coverage level specified in the indenture for their preferred stock and their bonds. So they had to get rate increases, or else they would be in default on their bonds or preferred stock, and then they would have been able to put profits up to Southern Company, their parent, okay, which needed it for dividends. So it was, their financial situation was not good, and it was because of their building program, and their building program was based on exponential growth of demand for electricity. Okay, I mean, you can't bet on exponential growth. You can't beat exponential growth. You can't build fast enough, right, to meet exponential growth. So it was fundamentally stupid. And they were in this mess where they had in this vicious cycle of having to get rate increases, and then having meant that they had to deal with us all the time. And we always had a case that we could mobilize people for and stuff like that. But the thing that we couldn't understand is why did they keep selling bonds? Why didn't Southern Company sell stock? Okay, and we kept trying to figure that out, and we knew that what would happen is that the new stock would be sold at a price lower than the old stock. Okay. And we weren't quite sure why that was either, but it was a true fact. So it meant that if they sold more stock, their existing stockholders would see their shares diluted. Okay? You didn't want to sell stock on a declining income. You wanted to sell it on a increasing income, right? Mm-hmm. So they didn't want to, but we were trying to figure out why it was that what was the underlying problem, and basically we were looking at it, trying to figure out it from a Marxist point of view, right? So basically what we eventually sort of came up with was, I tried to write about it, was unable to. Let's see if I can, that was years ago when it was fresh in my mind, but see if I can state it. The idea is that if productivity increases with scale, then as you add labor and other factors of production, then you get a more than proportional return so that everybody's better off. Okay, you can pay returns on capital, you can pay returns on labor, or you can exploit labor to give money to capital, depending on how you looked at it. Okay, and so then what we came to realize is that the new generation of power plants, they had gone from like a 500 megawatt coal plant to an 800 to 1,000 megawatt coal plant technology, okay, was that the return to the productivity did not increase to scale as it had in the past, that it wasn't that much better than what they had before, okay, and maybe with the case of nuclear, even worse, okay, in terms of how much actual output you got for how much actual input, okay, and therefore there were no new profits in the Marxist sense, the excess production, excess returns to production, to be gotten from the electric generation business itself, that they had to raise rates in order to extract profits from the other parts of the economy that were still seeing returns, increasing returns to scale. Okay, and so this led us to the Security and Exchange Commission, okay, under the Public Utility Holding Company Act. See, we all got to learn all this utility history, right?
Right.
We got to read all about learn about all about the power production process, and so like the how the industry started, and also this guy Samuel Insull, who was like this huge electricity magnate. He was originally British, okay, and so he was basically in charge of British propaganda in the United States to get the United States to enter World War I on the side of England, okay? And after the war, he proceeded to take this whole propaganda machine and turn it into a machine to do propaganda for the electric power industry, okay? And that was part of the issue, was like Georgia Power was everywhere. It was on television, it was at appliance stores, it was in with the Chamber of Commerce, it was just connected to the banks, it had so many connections in with the power structure, and so much influence on the media, and also on paid media, as well as, I guess they're calling it earned media this year. It's free media, in other words, getting their press releases into the paper, and their chairman, their president on the boards of all the civic associations, and stuff like that, and all throughout the state, and ties to all the legislators and lobbyists during the General Assembly, which Neil could write about, was written about just incredibly, just incredibly. At any rate, so we actually stopped South African coal, okay, and so that was a big success. But the SEC, so what happened is Samuel Insull started building this pyramid of companies that owned each other's stock and stuff like that, and built up a gigantic debt, okay, that the ratepayers of all these, and then at that time they ended up running street railways, like Georgia Power ran the trolley service here in Atlanta, until like the 60s, I think, then it broke off. At any rate, the electric companies became like this big financial spider web of connections that was totally out of control. And when the Depression came and electric demand went down, all of the securities failed, okay? And that led to the Public Utility Holding Company Act of 1935, maybe. It was like one of the early Roosevelt measures that restricted the capital structure of public utilities to have one layer of ownership only, and also it regulated intercompany transactions. So what had happened is these holding companies would have like coal procurement companies and power plants and different companies underneath them, and the operating companies, the distribution companies, would buy from stuff inside the thing at excessive prices, engineering and design, all kinds of stuff that it would buy from inside the corporate enterprise. So the Public Utility Holding Company Act put those under regulation, okay? And so there was, I forget what the nature of the proceeding was that they had to get approval for up there. But we intervened in that one, saying that this capital structure was just a house of cards, that they had to sell more stock, okay? Or else they were going to simply just completely overburden the ratepayers with money that cost too much. So by that time we had a lawyer working with us on staff, and we got him particularly to go up and argue this case before the DC Circuit. And when the time came, he decided he wanted to be an organizer. He didn't want to be a lawyer. It was really a big disappointment for me. But at any rate, so I guess it was during that time when Neil was remodeling his house, got this old house and was remodeling it, and so I forget where I got the money. I got a hunk of money and gave it to him so that he could do that, and I got in return a lease on the upstairs apartment.
And this is over in Inman Park?
This is in Greenwood Avenue. It's like across.
Oh, right.
Right. It's so like there's that shopping center across from the old Sears, and then there's a street up. But he had a big. There was like an empty lot next to it, which now the street takes a little curve through there, so the shopping center can be bigger. But he called it the South 40. He's a terrific gardener. He was like digging up kudzu and had like this vast garden plot. We had wonderful fresh okra every summer. God, it's so great to go out and pick okra and eat it immediately. Nothing better.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this is a completely irrelevant story, and probably you had to be there to like it, but I'll tell it anyway, because Neil probably didn't. Oh yeah. So.
And what year about is this?
I guess that we're talking here is maybe 73.
Okay.
Something like that. Okay.
So all that happened in the course of a year.
Maybe 74, something like that. Was it,
Yeah.
Let's see. So. Yeah, maybe this was 73, something by then. So, because Wounded Wounded Knee happened in 73. The takeover of the Pine Ridge Sioux Reservation by the American Indian Movement. And a number of people who were sort of legal related got involved in that, including Reber. He was up there for a while. Including Candy Hamilton, who I spoke about last time. Reber, Candy also lived in the house there over by Ponce de Leon and North Highland, and she's still there. Just found her using LinkedIn and Google the other day. So maybe we'll get her down here again. Maybe you can interview her too. Mm-hmm. At any rate, so Neil was courting his wife to be Claire, who was in med school in Augusta. And Neil is a big train fanatic, okay? So he would take the train from Atlanta to Augusta just about every weekend to be there with Claire. And the train was a mixed freight and passenger train, okay? It was like a real relic, okay? And the railroad, the Seaboard Coastline, which I think is now part of CSX, but at that time it was like there was the SCL and the ACL, and there were also like the Georgia Railroad and the Atlanta and West Point Railroad, which had started off as like state-built railroads at the time of the Civil War, and then by this point were being leased. Okay, so basically SCL ran all the railroads in Georgia. So they went to the public, and they called themselves the Family Lines. They were with L&N also, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. So they called themselves the Family Lines. So they went in to try and get this train discontinued. They were trying to get out of passenger service. Okay, and so Neil intervened. Okay, and so I went down to help Neil, and also our friend Phil Hoffman. Okay, so their statement was always their petition was brought on behalf of the Family Lines, collection of railroad companies joined by various leases and mortgages, mortgages and certificates of indebtedness. Okay, that was their legal description of themselves when they would file a petition or a lawsuit or something, right? Okay, so we styled ourselves as the family interveners. Okay, collection of individuals joined by leases, mortgages, and certificates of indebtedness. Okay, so we went down to the Public Service Commission for the hearings. Okay, and I'm pretty sure the lawyers were from Tennessee, if I remember correctly. So it's like their first time in front of the Public Service Commission. Okay, we had been in front of the Public Service Commission 25 times, right? Something like that, okay? The commissioners knew us, liked us, didn't know them, okay? And here we go, okay? We send them interrogatories, and they refuse to answer them, and we get up, and they argue and say, these interrogatories are completely irrelevant, okay, and we shouldn't have to do this. And they say, well, they're an intervener. They have a right to their interrogatories. It's like he expected everything was going to go his way, and things just didn't work out the way he kept expecting. Okay, there was one day, I went out and I checked in like the the Georgia Bar register in the Supreme Court building next door and didn't find the lawyer's name in the bar list there. Okay, so I came in and, asked him to move that he be disqualified because he's not a member of the Georgia Bar and therefore he can't practice, and he just went up in smoke, like he couldn't believe that, he's like, he wanted to get up and testify to his own probity, okay? I mean, things are off kilter when something like that happens, right? There was, I forget who was the chairman. They were rotating chairman at that point. So there was one point, when when a witness was finished and the chairman said, "So, Mr. Friedman, what shall we do next?" Okay. And so, at any rate, there was all this. So they fired back interrogatories to us, okay?
So was this lawyer dismissed?
No, he wasn't dismissed because it turned out that he had been left out of that book, okay? But he had paid his dues, okay? So they sent us interrogatories, and so they asked for what evidence of the leases, mortgages, and certificates of indebtedness, okay, to which we referred in describing our relationship, okay? And so the mortgage is my loan to Neil for the house. And the lease is the lease back of the apartment that match each other. And the certificates of indebtedness were cigarette coupons. I think they were from Chesterfields. I forget which one of them smoked Chesterfields. That Phil and Neil would use to make bets in the middle of ball games, like, I'm sure that, a lot of times he would sit on the front porch in the afternoon and watch Cubs games, okay, and so they would make bets. So here's Phil up there on the witness stand testifying about the certificates of indebtedness, okay, nowhere closer to cutting off the railroad than when we had started in months ago, okay. I mean, it got so that a railroading magazine had already published the demise of the mixed train to Augusta, okay, and it was still running. Neil was still going on it, Finally, they were able to get it. I think. I forget, what was it, at one point Commissioner Pafford, when a lawyer said, "Do you really want to be spending your time like this?" And so, I mean, because really there was, nothing to be done, once it was just a show. Once the witnesses were over, then they basically had no choice but to go with what the company wanted to do. So, but at any rate, so that was an amusing time that we had together. I guess I ended up spending as much time with that one story than with the whole Georgia Power Project. The Georgia Power Project was really good. I mean,
and how long did that go on for?
God, I think it's become, its offspring still exist, right? Oh, I know. Well, I think I showed you when we got we got investigated by the John Birch Society as being anti-capitalist, of trying to bring down capitalism. That was a big success. Oh yeah, they were building Plant Scherer, which is like just north of Macon near Jackson. Okay, and so the people there, Neil is just, a great organizer, loves to talk to people, real engaging, Dalton native, right? I mean, I'm sure you out there should go look at him. He's probably more interesting than me and briefer. But terrific carpenter, cabinet maker. At any rate, so he made friends with like all the farmers around where they were going to be taking land, you know, for the transmission towers and the cooling lake and stuff like that, you know. So we would go down there and, you know, get them organized and bring them up here and stuff like that. And one of them kept goats, okay, and we were down there and they were saying, yeah, see that goat over there, you know, he's getting pretty ornery. We're going to have to do something about that, you know. So about 6 weeks later, we said, come on down, we're having a goat barbecue. This is really tasty. So at any rate, it was a good project to have worked on. I guess the other stuff I wanted to talk about is
How long did you stay with that project?
Oh Lord, I think it was 2.5, 3 years, something like that.
So into 74 or?
Yeah, I think that would be right, something like that. Well, no, let's see. The Georgia Power, yeah, maybe 70, yeah, because 72 was the issue, and then 73 was Wounded Knee, so maybe I started that in 73 and stayed till 75 or 6 maybe. Right. So that gets me sort of back to law again. I mean, it may have been interrupted. It may have been piecemeal in there, because I did a couple of things, 3 things, but it was definitely after Georgia Power that that I got involved with the ACLU. The ACLU at this time was bringing challenges to the jury selection around Georgia, okay? And so they needed someone to go out and gather statistics, okay, that were then put together by a university professor who I forget at the moment, okay? And so, it would mean like going down to a county, getting records, jury selection records from the courthouse, identifying the race of everybody on the master jury list, okay? Then tracing the path from the master jury list to the trial as to who fell out when for what reason, okay? And also the same for the grand jury, but the grand jury at that time was like individually selected by jury commissioners. In some cases, jury commissioners individually selected even the master list, but a lot of places by that time they were too big to do that anymore, so they took like the voter list usually, and that was like their master pettit jury list, or maybe that would be their source that the jury commissioners would edit to remove people that they didn't think were fit for jury service, whereas the grand jury was inclusion, and so they were all white and they were all male, because a woman could just be asked to be excused and be excused at that point without any showing of hardship or anything. It was like, things that were discussed in the courthouse were just too strong for the ears of our women folk. So then I would gather those statistics and compare them with the census and show the discrepancies and, how it compared with the various legal standards that were available, because I could write briefs, right? learn how to do that. So that I started doing that, and in addition to the ACLU, there was also another lawyer who had been instrumental in the founding of the ACLU, who was a big supporter of the bird. His name was Al Horn. I showed his obituary, I guess, on the thing. So he was very important part of the liberal community, liberal activist sort of community here in Atlanta for many years. He was from Birmingham. He graduated from Harvard with honors, Harvard Law School with honors, but couldn't get a law firm position because of his politics. He ended up joining the regional office of the labor board here, along with Bill and Francis. I hope their names come back. George, Bill and Francis George. They were both lawyers there, and Bill became a target of the House Un-American Activities Committee, and they were going to fire him, okay, for having communist ties, and Al led a battle of all the NLRB regional office employees in support of Bill George, okay. And so Al did labor law. I'm pretty sure he did it with Adair Goldthwait, Stanford, and Daniel, or whatever its name was at that particular time, because he and Morgan Stanford were big buddies. Morgan was a big labor lawyer. At any rate, so Al, you can see him on page 2 of volume 3, number supposedly 10, but it says 10, but it was actually number 11. We had a lot of trouble keeping the front cover in line. But March 16th, 1970, on page 2, there's a picture of him. He has no beard there, but later on he had this big beard, and he was a real tall guy, looked like Moses or something like that, But he was, he always had a warm place in his heart for the community, and he was in favor of legalizing drugs, and he represented a lot of drug defendants, he was into music. Like, there was this nightclub, it had been a gay club actually, down sort of across from Grady. It was where their shopping center is now, across Monroe Drive from
Grady High School.
Yeah, Grady High School, backed up to the railroad tracks there, and it, it was way underdeveloped at that point. There was like a little burger shack right at Monroe, and then a big parking lot, and then this big club, okay, and so
do you know what the club was?
I'm trying to remember what its name was as a gay club, because I know I went there when it was a gay club. It was like the Purple or Indigo or Blue or something, I forget. But then it became, what happened is they went out of business, and Al got it and turned it into Richards and made it into a venue for rock music, okay?
So he owned this?
He owned it.
Okay.
Right. He was also one of like the first people to buy and refurbish a house in Inman Park. Okay, Inman Park when I got here was, all of the houses had been subdivided into rooming houses, right? So weekly occupancy, and all were dilapidated. So, at any rate, Bill and Lavinia George, that was her name. So Al also was one of the core group that founded the ACLU of Georgia. Okay, and I think Morgan Stanford was in the NLRB at the time, so he was in. Maybe that's how they got it. At any rate, so Al had an office up here on Peachtree Street, okay, with Margie Hames, who argued the Doe v. Bolton part of Roe v. Wade, okay, and later opened the first women's law office in Georgia. And another of his partners was Glenn Zell. And Glenn Zell had a lot of porno theaters as clients. Okay, so that case, the Slayton case that went up to Supreme Court, he argued that in the Supreme Court. Okay, and I'm pretty sure they had a fourth partner at that point, but he committed suicide somewhere along the line, and I was never really that close to him, Tom Harper. But at any rate, so Al had a lot of airplane marijuana importation cases at that time. And so he would hire me to go down into these counties to go in and do these jury selection studies, and then prepare the exhibits and the brief and testify. So I must be a little bit out of order here, and then see what would happen is that the ACLU and some of the other, I forget, was Millard Farmer was doing death penalty cases, and then Steve Bright was doing death penalty cases with the Southern Center for Human Rights. So what happened is I would do these statistics, but the same juries were being used for everything, and so like death penalty defendants were also adopting my motions and stuff, so I was able to go down and testify and present the evidence in their cases as well. So I did, and then I did that for quite a while in a lot of places. I did like 50 counties, something like that, by the time I was done with that. I also did federal courts. The federal ones were were bigger and were a lot harder, you know. But I discovered that when they were building the jury wheel here, they left out one county entirely. They were supposed to put in all the county's voter registration lists, and they just left this one county out. Okay. And so that affected all the grand juries, okay, that had been run for that wheel. And they basically had to close down jury trials here in the Northern District of Georgia for about 3 months while they reconstituted the wheel properly. And I believe the jury commissioner ended up losing her job, the federal jury commissioner. You know, it's hard to lose a job. Maybe she got transferred to another job, but there was a new jury commissioner afterward, you know, because the judges were so pissed off. They were doubly pissed off because they had said, oh, well, we're going to recuse ourselves and bring in this guy from Mississippi to hear the case so that, because we might be accused of bias. And unfortunately, the guy from Mississippi, it was right out of Alice's Restaurant. He was blind. It was a good case of American blind justice. He found that the facts were true and issued an order reconstituting the wheel. They would never have done that, right? They would have they would have hidden it somewhere. At any rate, so so it must have been before that that there was ML. So Ginny Bolt, Reber's ex-wife at that point, and another woman named Barbara Aiken, and I formed this company called ML Court Reporting and Paralegal Services. The idea, they bought and got trained on these mask devices where you speak what's being said into the mask and it gets recorded. Okay, and I was in the office and I did transcriptions. I was typing out transcripts. Okay, and that also meant that, like, whenever there were demonstrations or something like that, and there were arrests, then we would do the court reporting pro bono. Okay, because that had always been a big cost in terms of defending people at demonstrations, was the fact you needed a transcript. Okay, so so we did that. We did that not very long, but that was another example of like a self-supporting, movement-supporting enterprise that we were pretty proud of. That one showed up in our FBI files.
Oh, it did?
Yeah.
How many years did you do that for?
It didn't last all that long. I mean, they sort of decided that they would. I think either I went on to something else, or they went on to wanting to do their own transcripts. Is how that had happened.
And were your paying clients just sort of regular folks that? Well,
I mean, there were a host of liberal lawyers who would use us, right? Some of them were protégés of Al. Some of them were. Oh yeah. So Al was almost Hosea Williams' personal lawyer. Okay, whenever he needed free legal work, he would call up Al. Okay, and unfortunately, a lot of that had to do with Hosea's tendency to, after a few drinks, enjoying a drive. But he also, he had plenty of movement issue trouble as well. Okay, so at any rate, there were all these movement lawyers, and they became the Atlanta chapter of the National Lawyers Guild. Okay, it's like people who were sort of more movement than the ACLU was. Okay, because the Lawyers Guild was known for being radical. It had been the subject of the House Un-American Activities Committee. It was on the Attorney General's list back when there was this list of organizations that you could be denied a federal job for having been a member of. Stuff like that. And so the big thing inside the Lawyers Guild was that, especially at that time, the Lawyers Guild had, was law office sex roles. Okay, because you have a caste system. Okay, you've got lawyers and not lawyers. Okay, and then you've got these paralegals in the middle. What are they? Okay, but they're not lawyers. Okay, so you've got this caste system, which there are certain things that only lawyers can do, and that among them is own a law office. Okay, so you start off with a caste system inside of who's the owner, who's the employee, okay? Then you've got the sex role, okay? Very few female lawyers, okay? Very few male secretaries, okay? And then you've also got this sort of developing class of paralegals, of people who are not lawyers but know how to do lawyer tasks, okay? So you would see them doing title searches, or you would see them being investigators, or you would see them doing research, or different things, right? Putting evidence together. The Lawyers Guild was a place where everybody was equal, okay? Where the idea was to be a movement lawyer, or a movement legal person, okay? With equality, mutual respect, things like those egalitarian values, and the reflection of the women's movement and stuff like that. Because there were coming to be some women lawyers also, and they were experiencing glass ceiling and equal pay issues, right? So that was all like boiling, and so here was the Lawyers Guild. Now the Lawyers Guild did an awful lot of movement defense stuff. Less here in the South because there were fewer of us, and I'm trying to think. I think there was even a Southern SLAM, Southern Legal Action Movement, right? So there was a Southern organization of activist lawyers, okay, and that's what happened. So SLAM decided to merge with the Lawyers Guild, but even afterwards were Southern exceptionalists inside the Lawyers Guild. And so this eventually, what happened? When would this be? So this would be like in 1977. Okay, so in 1977, Al took the initiative, okay, and put together an entire floor of the Healy building, okay? So the big part, one big firm, one big part of it was the Law Project, okay, which was the law project of R. Bolt et al. Was his name. So R was Reber, okay. Al, okay. Benson and Tipton Lane, who was then a young black lawyer. Now she's a Superior Court judge. Okay, Charles Thornton, who was a young black lawyer then. Franklin. What was Marjorie? Franklin. I'll remember her. No, her not Franklin. She's from Franklin, Tennessee. That's why it's coming up. I'll remember her name because Mary Joyce Johnson. Okay, she became like the regional vice president of the NLG for the Southeast. Amy Totenberg, now a federal judge here. And about a similar number of paralegals, okay? And so that was formed in 77. I didn't join at the beginning, but I joined a little bit later, okay? And continued doing the jury stuff, and continued, actually got to do statistics on a employment discrimination case, a big employment discrimination case at Central State Hospital. Okay. Which was, successful in a strange way, in that they had this megalomaniac named Wilbur Owens, who was the federal judge in Macon. Okay, the Middle District has like Macon and Columbus. So they had J. Robert Elliott in Columbus, who was a complete royal asshole. Okay, and then they had this megalomaniac Wilbur Owens, and so Central State Hospital was like substantially all of Milledgeville and Middle Georgia. Okay, I mean, it's like the only big employer, right? And it was huge, okay? And it was completely segregated. Okay, I'll keep an eye on it.
Yeah.
It was completely segregated, and by job title. Like I was trying to build these promotion ladders to show, and I couldn't build them because the job titles were either all white or all black, right? There was no way to compare people. There was 0 versus 0, okay? So it wasn't very good from a statistical point of view. But it was, but he took it, but I said, well, nothing speaks louder than a 0. And so he picked up on that, and so he just took control of Central State Hospital, okay? And I know that Amy and Benny worked on that case for many years, as it had, until they closed Central State Hospital or reduced it down to what it is now. It's a very, very small thing. So that was one of the cases that I worked on. Oh, but that's one end of the 15th floor. The other end of the 15th floor was a new firm, Stanford, Fagan, and Giolito. Okay, a labor law firm. Stanford bolted from the firm and took Giolito and Fagan with him because they were all sort of more pro-labor, and the main partners, the Adaires, had wanted to start taking some management cases too over there, besides being not very good bosses. So the three came over and formed this new labor law office, brought a couple of union locals with them. Okay, so they were there. There was Will Hazelton and Holly Sullivan married, and they had an office in the middle, and they had another couple, I think, working with them. Okay, and they were highly political in the like progressive labor / the very fractionated labor, very fractionated movement organizations, the pre-party organizations, okay, the people who had decided that the mass movement was not sensible. They needed a vanguard party of small activist cells. Okay, so they were in this office. I think they came from Athens, and they've definitely gone back to Athens, but they've stayed active a long time. I saw them at Julian Bond's funeral, actually. And there was another small office, David Buffington, and who was David's partner? At any rate, everybody on the floor was like a movement lawyer, okay? So it became like a real, we shared the same library, it was like a real activist hotbed. We would, I don't think ML had, and what came to happen, okay, so let's see if I can get this. Again, I'm sort of out of order of a lot of this, because I haven't been able to really straighten it out. But there was the Harrisburg 7 trial with Father Berrigan, okay, there was a sociologist out of Columbia, I hope I'll remember his name. Okay, so he decided to help use survey methodology to identify jurors, okay, which basically involves administering a attitude survey in the area where the trial is being held, and then gathering demographics along with it, doing what's called a factor analysis, where you break down you see how answers of questions move together. So it forms a cluster that relates to a set of related attitudes. So instead of measuring individual question answers, you now use these factors to be your measure, and they turn out to have to do with things like authoritarianism, punitiveness, general liberal, conservative on law and order, okay, typical set of factors that would come out of that. And then you would use another technique to take the demographics and relate them to factor scores. Which demographics had high factor scores, which demographics had low factor scores, and the ones that had low factor scores were the ones that you wanted on the jury, and the ones high, the ones that you didn't. And in addition to that, he brought into play some psychologists. I guess he was a psychologist rather than a sociologist, but he worked with sociologists on that. Some people who were into nonverbal communication, okay? And so he brought them in to be courtroom watchers, okay? And then he got together some lawyers to actually train lawyers as to how to ask questions of jurors, okay? I mean, it used to be, it was very pro forma, very short, very closed-end questions, okay? And the goal was to make it last longer, have open-ended questions, let the juror express themselves, ask them questions that would expose their attitudes, okay? Let the psychologist observer try and identify, and let the demographics try and come up with like a base score. So you come up with a base score from the demographics as to how desirable the juror is. Then you use the other information to come up with a phone. So that's what's called systematic or scientific jury selection. And so that was where jury consultants as a trade came into existence. Okay, out of that trial, people from that, Beth Benora from San Francisco, she's still doing it. Diane Wiley from Minneapolis, not sure she's at Minneapolis, but she's still doing it. Margie Fargo from DC, I think is still doing it. Oh God, why can't I remember her name? Psychologist, she went to West Georgia. I got my apartment on Myrtle Street from her. She did jury selection with Millard Farmer. I hope that some of these names will come back to me. I can't believe I can't remember that name. At any rate, so Margie Fargo then was from Gainesville, Florida, and so she did her graduate work down in Gainesville, and there was a movement trial down there, some Vietnam vets, the Gainesville 7, something like that. There were lots and lots of trouble. So she did jury work on that, and sort of like organized it down there, and decided that she wanted to do jury work in the South, and that Atlanta was the right place to come. So she came to open the Southern office of the National Jury Project. Okay. And So it seemed natural for me to work with her, because then I wasn't working directly for the lawyer in the law office, right? I was working for the jury project, and it, gave a little better appearance in court. So, and, yeah, I mean, Margie was just another of these really deep, really, wonderful people, women that, that I've known. We were a couple for a while. Not a very good idea to couple up inside where you work, especially when it's a two-person office. But yeah, it's like she had her apartment's up on Bonaventure, and I was living upstairs from Neil on Greenwood, so it's about 10 blocks going down over the railroad and back up again, and I'd leave there to walk home, and I was walking on the moon, right? It was popular, was the song then. I was just walking on the moon. It was great for a while.
So what years might this have been?
That's what I'm having trouble
Okay.
disentangling. It's got to be after Georgia Power Project, okay? And I think it's also after Law Project, but that would have put me in Law Project for a very short period of time, and that felt like a long period of time. If this video is able to be transformed into modern technology, that video was taken at the Law Project, so there would be maybe some objective reality to help straighten this out.
And that, just for reference point, that's the video that you brought that said
I brought
documentary.
It was a documentary that
Extra.
was done by one of the guys on Extra. After Extra folded, he followed up to see where people had been and what they thought of their time on Extra. And it's called Youthful Folly, which is a tarot symbol. No, not tarot. It's I Ching. It's the I Ching.
Okay.
One of the patterns. It's called Youthful Folly. Okay. So, at any rate, to return with us now to the legal stuff, right? Is that Al, what to say? Okay, so the Lawyers Guild, the activist lawyers, okay, and we're helping with movement and people getting arrested and stuff like that. So that was very exciting and productive, but sort of limiting in terms that you didn't want to be arrested at a demonstration, and B, you didn't want to be so out front that you were going to be considered biased. Okay, so you had to sort of withdraw, but at the same time you were doing this movement-related stuff that was, really good. So during the time of the Law Project, we also did prison. We also worked on prison work out of that, because some of our clients ended up in prison, right? And so Al decided pretty much by himself that it was something had to be done about Reedsville. The conditions were just too bad, with both physically with heat and physical space and overcrowding and racism and lousy food and just impossible, okay? And so he organized a march. He called in all of his chits. He made Hosea come down and be a leader of this march, you know. Called in labor union people, got, you know, the movement adopted it too. So there was a march. It took about 5 days, as I recall, from Savannah to Reidsville, okay, to publicize conditions at Reidsville. And I believe it did have some results, but I mean, there's a lot of people who went looking for gurus and stuff, you know, during this time. And I guess, I mean, this day it's thought a good thing to have mentors when you're young, to pick up good mentors. Then with the generation gap, you know, there wasn't much in the way of good mentors. But for me, Al was a really great mentor. He died way too soon. He died in 1985 of pancreatic cancer. He was a good man and did a lot with his life. And I hope there's someone. Oh, by the way, Jury Project. Yes. Okay. Now I'm going to mess up the name. It's right up there. It's Diane. Your Woman Studies program was, what is her last name? Not Simon.
Oh, Diane Folks.
Diane Folks, right. Diane Folks was one of the academics that worked with the Southern Office of the National Jury Project for a while. And Larry Noble, I don't know, I think he was from Morehouse. You know, and we did some of the computer work on doing these factor analysis and breakdown studies at the computer lab here at Georgia State.
Okay.
Okay, so you're in the picture too. Maybe you. After the there came a time when I was just tired of being an expert witness. It's like it was always the same thing. Have you ever found a jury system that was good? Have you ever testified the jury system was good? No, because if it was good, the lawyer wouldn't put me up. I've told lawyers that there was no challenge. You know, how much are you getting paid for? You know, I mean, it was just pure ad hominem stuff, you know. And I really prided myself on how careful I was with my work, you know. And but I did learn a lot about rural Georgia. I just got to go to a lot of places, you know. So as I told you, I had bought this very early computer, okay? And so I started looking, because like way back when we left me in 1967, you know, I had been interested in, you know, I had been headed for computers, okay? And I had missed them, and now with this personal computer thing, I had an opportunity to get back into computers. So I began doing some consulting work in personal computers, okay? And no longer had the constraints on political activity that I had before.
And is this the late 70s, early 80s by this?
So this would be like the Law Project was formed in 77, okay? Steve Biko was killed in South Africa in 77. The Sandinistas won in Nicaragua in 79. Okay. And around that time, so it would be probably around 79, around the time I was became interested in Latin America. And there was an organization called the Atlantic Committee for Latin America. Actually, it had been formed by one of these pre-party organizations to try and be like a front group to work to gather new recruits and stuff like that. It had sort of fallen apart. But there was, by the time I got involved with it, I mean, there was a lot of church involvement. The People's Coalition for Peace and Justice, the Friends Service Committee. There were a fair amount of Christian organizations and a fair amount of left political organizations as well, it was not quite a coalition, but it's like people contributed people, right? It was like an okay thing to do, to be involved. And it was another place where people from different organizations could get together and work on an issue, and I got pretty involved in that. I put out its newsletter for a number of years. I put out some books that were written by this one guy who did study tours of Central America, did one on the Mosquito Indians, did one on, I guess that's the one that stands out in my mind. He was in ACLA. But the thing is that Reagan came into office in 1980. I was already with ACLA, okay? I think I was already with ACLA somewhere around in that time. But I was definitely already active when the Second Bird starts up, and the Second Bird was devoted to defeating Ronald Reagan, okay?
And that's 84.
Right. It was done starting before the second election campaign. So it was sort of a conflict of interest, because here I was struggling to put out this monthly newsletter about events in Latin America, okay, but also wanting to do Latin America stuff in the Bird. I was willing to help out with help do the Bird, but it didn't really reach critical mass. Unfortunately, it didn't get self-propelling, and part of that, I guess, was what had knocked out originally is that we had survived on record ads a lot. That had been a big part of our income, okay? And first, the combination of the FBI going to the record companies as part of this COINTELPRO, and the rise of the free newspaper sort of. And they got a lot of ads, right? Mm-hmm. So that sort of knocked our ecological niche out a little bit. Okay, creative loafing. So it didn't last too long, but it was voted there. So I was a lot politically. One of the regular things is that we had the Army School of the Americas located down in Columbus at Fort Benning, okay? And that was, we called that the School of Assassins, because that was where they brought in officers from Central and South America to learn basically counterinsurgency techniques and anti-popular warfare. Okay, so for years now, it's still going on. There's been a regular annual vigil there, even though they've changed the name of it now. Father Roy Bourgeois is the person who's well known for that. He served time. He's one of several people who served time in jail for trespassing Fort Benning during those demonstrations. And again, we did some good stuff. Like I remember one year we went down there and we planted a rose bush. It was because the rose was the symbol after I believe it was Romero's death, and after Bishop Romero was assassinated, in 1980. Okay, and then in December of '81, we had the massacre of the it's a town that they basically in El Salvador, because El Salvador was also having a civil war at that point, that was basically wiped out by the troops, by the Salvadoran army, and bodies were just thrown in the river, and it was way inland, and no one even knew about it until body parts started coming out of the river. It's just really disgusting. So we planted a rose bush there. Then we did some other stuff in there. We did Robin Singer was big in this. It was Oats for Peace. It was Fund for Southern Cooperatives. I think that's right. It's like a black land organization here in Atlanta that is like a service organization for black-owned farms and farm cooperatives. Okay, and so we arranged with them for them to grow oats. Okay, and we had these sacks made. So the oats were then carried down. Where did we get them milled? Remember, we had a caravan because we had to get them milled from being like oats that you harvest to being oats in a sack, right? And basically turned into oatmeal at the same time. So, and then delivered those down for children's food programs in Nicaragua. So that was a really good one, and we did so of course Reagan mined the harbors of Nicaragua. Okay, and in response to that, we mined the Federal Building. We had those little wooden silver squares with helium balloons on them that we...
Right, so refer back to the first interview video. At the very end, you showed some of the bags for the Oats for Peace and these mines. Right.
So, so that was another... So, Atlanta had this band called Elise Witt and the Small Family Orchestra. That was one of the bands that usually played at demonstrations. They were very socially minded, and they had gone down to Nicaragua. They'd played basically a USO tour of the government side of Nicaragua. Okay, and so they came back all charged up, and they were wanted to go to a demonstration in Washington. Okay, a Central America demonstration in Washington, and ACLA was sponsoring the buses, arranging for the buses for it. And I was selling tickets for it one day, and one of the women in the band, the flute player, came in to buy her ticket, and we sort of joked around and had some fun. And so then on the Saturday, when it came time to go on the march, so the trick on the march buses is like to bring a lot of stuff and sort of surround yourself in it and look sort of fierce, and then maybe no one will sit by you, and you'll have a double seat for this to sleep on during the overnight trip to D.C. Well, she saw me get on the bus, and so she decided to get on the same bus. And, I saw her get on the bus when she came in, and so I pull in all this stuff, and make it clear that the seat's available, and she comes in and sits next to me. And so we've been married for 28 years now, something like that.
What's her name?
Her name's Beth Heidelberg. Yeah. So so that was a life-changing event. Basically, the last time I went down to Columbus to the demonstration, she was pregnant, okay, and I was arrested during the civil disobedience. And it looked for a while like they were fed up with the civil disobedience, and they were going, in the past they'd just given you an exclusion letter from the base, and said, well, this time they're going to charge misdemeanors, okay? And they eventually dropped the misdemeanors, so I ended up with no problem, but it definitely called to my attention the fact that I had responsibilities now that I hadn't had in the past, and so I've spent most of the time since then until my retirement last year just, trying to make a good income in life for Beth and Philip, and...
And what year did you get married?
Luckily, I wrote it down. 1988. We had lived together beforehand, so the 88 is, there comes a time, you gotta make up your mind.
Right.
Right. So we've been married since 88.
And Philip was born...
Philip was born in 91.
Okay.
So, right.
And what did you do for your livelihood? The last time that we checked in, you were computer consulting.
Right. So that basically,
so from
that's sort of what I've done is that I've done computer stuff. Then I had a couple of about three or four consultancies of less than 2 years, and I had one job with an environmental engineering firm for 6 years, and then I did.
What firm was that?
I think I'd rather not say that.
Okay.
And then I did 16 years with various contracting firms at CDC. And I mean, the interesting thing in this particular range of stuff was that I did get to work on international HIV/AIDS stuff, helping countries develop their medical tracking systems and supply systems and statistical systems, mostly related to HIV, but to try and do it, in a way that would serve the whole health system to the greatest extent possible, not just a single system for HIV. At any rate, that was, I got to do a fair amount of work in Ghana. I got to go to Johannesburg, and I saw the Apartheid Museum there. That was a very moving experience for me. It's pretty incredible. It's like you go there and you're given a ticket, right? Whites, you get one ticket, and blacks and coloreds get another. and you go in through separate doors, right? And, you know, and you start like from the early history of the African National Congress and its predecessors in like 1904 or something like that. You go through all of the struggles, the people that were hanged, the massacres. They have one of those hippopotamus police tanks there. It was just so moving, so incredibly moving, and the whole thing, like the inside is like, it's like divided up with bars, right? So you feel like you're in prison the whole time, you know. Just was an incredible place, you know. I did a fair amount of work in Ghana. Got to go to W.E.B. Du Bois's burial place and library. That was very nice. I got to go to El Salvador. I had been to El Salvador just after the Jesuits were killed on some sort of international solidarity tour. I mean, we had to pretend like we were going there on vacation. We had to look like, and which was sort of crazy because like the streets are filled with trucks full of soldiers with automatic weapons, you know. I mean, just a horrible, oppressive environment, you know. And then got to go back there, and it was before the left won their first election, you know. But that was very interesting. I got to go out in the countryside, and it's still like very depopulated. People haven't really returned, and it's got like no agricultural infrastructure at all, like tractors, silos, you know, automated equipment. You know, it's horses and people. It's very. They had at least at that time, had a lot of problems with people committing suicide by insecticide. Just people who didn't see any other way to live, you know. It was you know, it was like, got to learn some more economics too, you know, like, you know, why is it that corn in San Salvador from the United States costs less than corn in El Salvador, grown in El Salvador? So it was, you know, went to Guatemala, so some of that too. Guatemala, we studied Spanish there. After, this is, you know, when I was 50, I started learning Spanish. We wanted Philip to have another language, so we started going down in the summer to learn Spanish, and I really liked that. Like the culture, like the people, but like it's so horribly oppressed down there. It's like, you know, the 1954 U.S. invasion and then all of the counterinsurgency training, you know, it's like they have this counterinsurgency squad called the Cabilda. I don't know that they're still training them that down there, but basically when you came in, you were given a dog, okay, and part of your graduation exercise was to kill the dog. Okay, I mean, and they're involved in a lot of death squads, really, really horrible, and it's total racial genocide against the Indians, and no one, you know, you can't even talk about it, you know. Prosecutors, they try and prosecute it, they get death threats, They finally, what is his name? He's in prison now. He was the president. He made himself the dictator. Rios Montt. When I was, never mind, I don't need to talk about Rios Montt. He's in jail.
What is it? Did your wife have a career as well?
Yeah, she's a musician.
She continued that all those years. Yeah.
Well, yeah, not with so much the same band. That band, sort of broke up because Beth and I got married. It's like everybody looked around and said, if Beth and Roger can get married, why can't we? And did.
Because how old were you?
I was 40, I guess, when we got married. Yeah. So, it was. But then, and also when she was pregnant, she spent a certain amount of time just dealing with Philip. But then she got in another band that toured, okay, and so I was like a single parent of a nursery school, early elementary school child.
You had good training for it at the Bird.
I had good training for it at the Bird. Exactly. So, and since I've retired, I've been working mostly in the activism has mostly been dedicated toward the reproductive rights movement. I'm a clinic escort at Planned Parenthood and volunteer for a couple of organizations as well. So here we are.
So from this standpoint here, 40, getting closer to 50 years after the Bird, how do you sort of reflect and feel about that era of your life, that era of time?
Well, I mean, I have my list of events here, right? Things were really happening, okay? I'm glad I'm where I was, okay? I mean, from sort of a moral point of view, you almost had to be there. There's, anybody who, John Negroponte, okay? John Negroponte was like the Reagan administration's ambassador to Honduras, where all of the activities against El Salvador and Nicaragua were organized, okay? And of course, he's still one of those big hawks who's up there, okay? So he's been on the other side his entire life, okay? I'd so much rather be me than John Negroponte, okay? And no one may remember me, and his name will go down in, histories of Central America and stuff like that, but I don't care, you get one life and you have to live it according to your lights. You shouldn't be stupid, you should, it's not like, if you're brought up in segregation, you should forever stick yourself to segregation, and that's your lights, and there you go. You've got to change with the times, or else be left behind and get bitter and use suntan spray. Get nostalgic for stuff that never was. I hope that I've kept the nostalgia out of this. I get hit by it from time to time, but But it's really, it's all, it's all been motivated by that same thing of like a movement against injustice, a movement against war, a movement against imperialism. They're still my core beliefs. I still support them. I honor people who devote their lives to them in ways that I can't. So, it's like the Denise Levertov poem about tear gas. Yes, it's tear gas. Yes, but there's no other place where you could be. This is where you had to be. You had to participate in the tear gas, because what was the alternative? To be on the balcony looking down, like John Mitchell and William Rehnquist? So, yeah, I wish I had, my personal characteristics were better, that I'd have, treated a number of women a lot better, okay, that I'd been aware, been sensitive to other people's feelings and needs better than I have been. I try, but no, all the stuff that sort of like the main line that we've talked about has all been about political motivations, political actions, involvement in a national and international movement to bring about peace and justice. So, I wish we had built more institutions, okay? I don't care if they were like VFW bingo halls, right? If we were, just making money off of them now. It would be nice if we had built more institutions that stayed around, that could serve as nuclei around which people could gather, or to which people moving into an area could go to discover, right? But I wanted to say this too. It's like it's an Al Hornism, right? It's like Al was dying, right, when Reagan was in office, and what Al said was that it used to be that we were all in the same boat, okay, that we were all looking out for each other, but Reagan has broken that deal. Now it's the rich get richer, and his being somewhat older, he had more of the Depression experience, I think, when there was a lot more of, there were, people stopping landlords from evicting tenants during the Depression. There were people doing soup kitchens during the Depression. There were people collecting stuff for each other and taking care of each other a lot during the Depression. Okay? Now some must get rich first. I don't know, maybe people are saying that this election this year and the values that it displays are like the culmination of this individualism that's been going on, but no one points to where did the individualism start, right? I'll go with Hal. I'll blame it on Reagan. It's like he saw absolutely nothing wrong with people being rich, regardless of how they got rich. And in fact, he rather found it more pleasant to be with rich people than poor people. right?
Mhm.
Eugene V. Debs, he's not.
No.
So, I don't know, you have any other good questions?
You mentioned that you are doing volunteer work as an escort at Planned Parenthood. What are some of the other ideas or ideals that are most important to you at this point in your life?
Well, an experience that I had when I went back to El Salvador when I was at CDC, and which also matches my experience in Ghana, okay, is in all of these countries, okay, you meet people who are totally out for number one, okay, who are trying to get in position to pick up a little money as it comes flying by, okay, to make more come fly in their direction, okay. And at the same, hello?
Okay, had a power
Okay.
failure for a second. Now we're back.
Okay, so I was saying that, in both El Salvador and in Ghana and, elsewhere, I've met people who were solely out to make it for themselves. And I've met other people who want to see their country succeed. Okay, I mean they hope to succeed themselves, but they want their country to succeed, to catch up with first world in terms of health and technology. I know in El Salvador, the people like that I met felt like they had lost so many years to the Civil War that they had to make up. People in Chile, I traveled and visited Chile, a lot of people wanting to make something different, I mean, when your president was a political prisoner in this torture building, she doesn't talk about it, but her father never recovered after that. But that there are good people working around the world, okay, and to just try and find them and unite with them and help them, it's as a generation, I don't think we've done a zillion things, some of which are amazing, but somehow I feel like the world that we're leaving to our kids is in many ways not as good as the world that we received, maybe the world we received that I see is due to where I come from, and these other changes that have brought other people forward are extremely important. I definitely, I guess I've been saying over and over that I find all these movements important, but just as far as ecology goes, or the respect for the environment, okay, I mean, I would have thought that pot would have been legal everywhere 30 years ago, right? And, I mean, I public transportation, right? have we ever recovered from Gwinnett and Cobb not agreeing to join MARTA, you know. We wouldn't have had to build a Brave Stadium out there because we would have had transit from there down to this Brave Stadium.
Mm-hmm.
So, at any rate, I think, you know, I guess when I was looking for world revolution and change, right? You know, so we didn't quite get that, okay? But we've got some important things. We've made some. There are no more colonies except Puerto Rico. You know, I don't know. We don't have another 4.5 hours to do a tour of the horizon today. It's not a very beautiful horizon.
No.
But hopefully the election will come out okay, and the Middle East will come out okay, and Russia will come out okay. Southeast Asia will come out okay. But it won't be me who decides that or makes it happen. My time is up.
But folks come after.
Yeah.
And struggle continues.
Philip surprised me. He's a one-worlder. He's a complete one-worlder. He's like, he was a Bernie fanatic, you know. And he's telling, you know, he's talking about unfairness, and like he doesn't distinguish between like this country and other countries, you know. It's like injury to one is an injury to all, right?
Mm-hmm.
The international party shall be the human race.
So do you keep up with any of the bird folks?
More since the reunion.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the 40th reunion was the one that got the collection going and stuff like that. A lot of it is via email. I'm hoping to take a trip out to Albuquerque and visit Reber sometime soon. He's several years older than I am. He did some other incredible stuff, you know. He did GI work in the Philippines and Japan. Okay, he nearly got rolled up when Marcos did a coup against himself and then imposed police state. He did Wounded Knee. He worked with Wounded Knee for many years. Another cause. Incomplete. Who was it that was just saying that they went to Pine Ridge and it was so terrible? One of the candidates, maybe? Did Hillary go to Pine Ridge? I don't think so.
I'm not sure.
Maybe Elizabeth Warren. I'm not sure, but somebody came back from Pine Ridge talking about how maybe it was Bernie who went to Pine Ridge, who said, you know, the life expectancy on Pine Ridge is less than the life expectancy in the developing world. So, I don't know, as long as there are people in every country, these patriotic people who want to see their country succeed, okay, and are willing to give up a little of themselves in order to make that happen, you know, then maybe we'll turn out okay.
It's a hopeful sentiment.
I don't want to end up totally in the pits.
No.
This is for, eternity, right? I mean, I remember, I remember the video that we still don't know whether he's going to get to see or not, or she, but I know that there was, the last question sort of in that one was, how do you feel about the years, about the time that you spent on extra, And I think my response was something like, well, I thought I made good use of my youth. So, but I don't think there'll be a sequel. I think you'll have to do prequels after this.
Well, that covers everything that I had. We've had many hours together, and I thank you very, very much for taking this time and all the thought and preparation. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think I've gotten everything out. I want to, thank you for the opportunity, and I sympathize with any graduate student who's reached this far, because you've probably got 6 more or 7 more to look at by the time it's available. But hey, it's only bits.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Well, thank you. I'll go ahead and turn off now.
Okay.